Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for your kind introduction. Cultural models of language variation. What is that all about? Well, let me first situate this in the overall architecture of the 10 lectures I have the privilege of giving here in Beijing. We've now arrived at what I've identified in some of the earlier lectures as conceptual onomasiological variation. For those of you who did not witness the initial lectures, this is about cultural and historical and social differences in categorization, in how people categorize the world and in how they choose categories to talk about the world. Now, in the talk, in the first talks that I gave, the ones on semasiological variation and the introductory ones, what I did was, in a very general way, to point to the importance of social and cultural and historical factors, and specifically social and cultural and historical variation when you study linguistics. Then this morning, I zoomed in specifically on categorization. And I try to show that categorization doesn't just fall out of the air, but that categorization has cultural and historical roots. Okay? So we have these, in the talks, we have these two main ideas, We have the emphasis on sociocultural variation, and specifically this morning we had an emphasis on cultural models. What I want to do in this talk is, in a sense, to have the snake bite its own tail. Because what I'm going to do now is to have a look at variation in the cultural models that people use to talk about language variation. Okay? So it's variation in models about variation. That's what it's going to be about. The materials I'm presenting can be found in chapter 11 of this book that I referred to this morning as well, The Words and Other Wonders volume, which is published in 2006. So my starting point for now is the question, cultural models, as we saw, are prime examples of conceptual onomasiology, of looking at variation in categorization from the semantic point of view and from the social point of view. But we've also mentioned earlier, and that was also part of the lecture delivered by Professor Christiansen, that language attitudes are an important part of studying language variation. Studying language variation is not just about what people do in a different manner, in one dialect or another dialect. It's also about how people think and feel about language variation. So the question for this afternoon will be, can we identify the full spectrum of underlying cultural models, the cultural models that shape linguistic debates, that shape debates about linguistics? Well, about linguistics, let's say about language variation. Not about linguistics as an academic discipline, but about language variation. And is there, if we look at these underlying models, is there some kind of logic behind them? Do they have an internal way of reasoning that we can analyze and that we can compare between the different models? And my answer to that question will be that we need to distinguish between 4 different types of models, which are, in a sense, combinations of 2 basic factors. Okay, that's complicated, but let me put it this way. First, I will argue that at a very fundamental level, we need to distinguish between 2 antithetical underlying models, a rationalist one and a romantic one. And the rationalist one is about language as an instrument, and the romantic one is about language as an expression of identity. Okay? So those are the 2 basic perspectives that we need. And those perspectives are, in some extent, in opposition to each other. That's why we call them antithetical. But then maybe strangely enough, then we can also see that we find ways of talking about language variation and thinking and feeling about language variation that present a synthesis of these two underlying tendencies. And the syntheses that we will present are what I will call a nationalist synthesis and then a postmodern synthesis. Now, in talking about nationalism and postmodernism, you automatically notice that there is, again, like in some of the other talks, a diachronic dimension to what I'm doing. Okay? There is a chronological succession of models. So I will be going through a number of stages in the way people have actually been thinking about language variation. I also want to make clear from the start that the models in question, so let's say the two basic models and then the four models if you expand them a little bit, that the models apply both to interlinguistic diversity, let's say the relationship between different languages, and to intralinguistic variation, the relationship between various dialects of one language. And it's fairly obvious that it should be that way because we know, and we've heard that in one of the other lectures, that the distinction between a language and a dialect is not so clear. So it's quite, it is to be expected that the models we use to talk about variation between languages can also be applied to variation within one language. Okay, the steps to take then are as follows. I will first present the two archetypal models of linguistic variation, which in the history of ideas, if we may put it that way, can be related to the 18th century. And that's going to be the rationalist and the romantic model, as I already said. And then there is a first transformation, if you wish, of those two models in the 19th century. Then we get nationalist ideas about language variation. And there is a second transformation which arises in the late 20th century, and that's the postmodern transformation of the two models. I might perhaps also remark that language ideology, because in a sense this is about language ideology, is not my dominant field of research, but what has brought me to this field is are in fact two parts of development. One is from descriptive studies in lexical variation, of which I've presented some materials in the previous lectures, to questions about language attitudes with regard to variation. I already explained that is a natural extension. And then there is this other path which came up this morning as well, where we go from the general framework of cognitive linguistics to applying the notion of cultural models to conceptions about language. Now, the rationalist model. What are the basic elements of a rationalist conception of language? As I already indicated, the very central point is that we think about language as a means of communication. Now let's apply that to the variation that you might have within one language between a standard variety of the language and other varieties. Dialects, regiolects, sociolects, whatever. All kinds of lects. I repeat, lect is the word that I will be using to refer to all kinds of varieties of one language. Right? So lect is a cover term for dialect, regiolect, sociolect, whatever. So when we have the idea that language is a means of communication, how will we think about the relationship between the standard language and the other lects that exist within the language, the other variants in the language? Well, from a rationalist point of view, the standard language is the preferred variety because it is a neutral means of communication, and it is a collective means of communication. The standard language is the standard precisely because it is there for everybody. because it is that variety of a language that is in principle shared by all members of the linguistic community. So from that point of view, a standard language should also conform to certain requirements, because a standard language, in order to fulfill its role as a means of communication, should be a neutral means of communication. A standard language should be above the dialects and the other lects, and it should not be recognizable as one of the dialects, because in that sense it would no longer be a neutral means of communication. And if we want perfect communication, the channel in which we communicate should in principle be neutral. It follows, as a further step, that language variation is not something that you will value very highly, because language variation would be difficulty for communication. If there's too much variation, the communication goes away. Communication becomes difficult. So from a rationalist point of view, the rationalist point of view that sees language primarily as a means of communication, dialects and other forms of language variation are not so very interesting. They are rather impediments to communication than something that you should value. One further aspect of all of this is the question now, why should we have communication? Why should we have a neutral means of communication? Well, there you get another aspect of the ideology, and it's not a coincidence that I use the term rationalist here, because this whole idea fits in with the ideals of the Enlightenment as a historical stage in the history of thinking. Because in the 18th century Enlightenment, the idea is also that people can freely determine their own fate, their own life, and that societies should be built up in an open way, that all people can communicate within the society. And in order to communicate, you need a neutral means of communication. At least that's the idea. So behind this rationalist conception of language is also a certain conception of what emancipation means. Why do we need communication in a society? Because everybody should be able to participate. Okay? That's the background. That's a historical background, at least. With this rationalist model, we get, and this is a pattern that I will use for all the four models. I'll say something about the internal logic, and then I will also say something about the kind of rhetorical, discursive strategies that I use. So the logic is that an optimal communication requires maximal uniformity and maximal neutrality in the channel of communication. Now, notice I'm saying all of this without committing myself to that. I don't know whether this is true, okay? None of us knows whether this is true. Well, maybe all of you know individually. But I'm just trying to explain the way people think about it. And we'll see at the end how difficult it is actually to think about it in a totally open and neutral way. But we'll see that. Now, if you have a neutral means of communication, where does the neutrality reside? Neutrality with regard to what? Well, at least geographical neutrality. The standard language should not be the language of just, let's say, one province. If it's the language of one province, it's not a standard language. And if it's the language, no, I'll be coming to that later. Okay. It should also be neutral, socially neutral. It should not just be the language of the elite. If it's just the language of the elite, it's not socially neutral. And within this ideal scheme of things, we want neutrality. And it should also be, and that's a very specific kind of neutrality, it should also be thematically universal. That is to say, you should be able to talk about anything in the standard language. Because if you're not able to talk about anything in the standard language, it does not fulfill its aim of being an optimal means of communication. So what we want is geographical generality, social neutrality, thematic universality. And that's also what you see in the actual development of standard languages. If you think of the European languages, standardization often goes hand in hand with explicit attempts to build the language, to develop the language. For instance, to make new words, precisely to achieve this form of thematic universality. And then another very important point is that the standard language, in order to be a neutral means of communication and a means of communication in which everybody can participate, in order to achieve that aim, everybody should have access to the standard language. Everybody should be able to learn the standard language, which means that you need education in the standard language, or at least in the standard language in the sense of helping people to acquire the standard language. If it's indeed your ideal that everybody should be able to communicate with all the other members of the linguistic community by means of this neutral means of communication, then you need educational efforts to ensure that everybody can speak and write in that language variety. And if you then have a look at the way in which people defend this conception of language, then you can see that people will refer to educational opportunities, to social mobility, to democratic participation. And, well, in some cases there would also be a debate about language reform in the sense of what can we do to make the language even more optimal, if that is possible. But so, for instance, social mobility, the types of arguments that you would get would be, it is important for people to learn the standard language because that will help them to make their way in society. Okay? That's the type of argumentation you would get. Now, let me give you, but I realize that this may require some translation. Let me give you a few quotes from the Enlightenment period, from the end of the 18th century, in which we find very explicit formulations of this rationalist conception of language and of standardization. And the quotes that I have here, these are French quotes from two reports, one by Barrère and the other one, oh no, that's going too far, one from Barrère and then from another source, two reports that were written for the revolutionary government in France after the French Revolution. You know, 1789 French Revolution. Then they had the revolutionary government, and one of the questions they debated was, well, what should we do with French as a language? And we have on French territory, we have a number of different dialects, and we even have a number of languages that are only vaguely related or not related to French. What are we going to do with this form of intralinguistic and interlinguistic variation, if we can put it that way? And totally in accordance with the rationalist Enlightenment ideals of the French Revolution, they thought that they should wipe out language variation. Their idea was, in order to serve the democratic revolution and the liberation of the French people, we need only one language. And that's what you find in these quotations. So these are people writing for the revolutionary government and saying, one language is enough. So they say things like this. I'm not going to read the French to you. Let me just give you a few translations. Well, let me read the first sentence. Citoyens, la langue d'un peuple libre doit être une et la même pour tous. Citizens, the language of a free people should be one and the same for everybody. That is to say, we need a language that is common to all and that is general. Another example, let me try to translate. When what it says literally is when the lights, that is to say, the ideals of the Enlightenment, right? When the ideals of the Enlightenment are with great effort brought to the periphery of France, they die out. Okay? They die out because when they reach the peripheral areas, the laws that we bring to the people are not understood because they don't understand the French in which they are written. If we leave the citizens in ignorance of the national language, that means that we are betraying the revolution and betraying our country. It means that we... No, that's not so important to translate this. Let me leave it at that. So what it says is the absence of a common language blocks the emancipation and blocks the revolution in this case. Further aspects of this same report, and here you get then the reaction against language variation as it existed in the old regime, in the pre-revolutionary times. The tyrants said, by the tyrants they obviously mean the aristocrats and the old monarchs, yeah, the kings that we chased. Okay? They said, let us abuse, let us use badly instructed people or those who do not speak, or rather, or those who speak a language or a dialect that is different from the language of public education to maintain our position. So by depriving people from education, you keep them ignorant, but in order to give them education, you also need a language to do so, and it had better be the same language that you use for all your public life. So, education is necessary to ensure that people can participate in the open society. This is the second report that I mentioned, one by Grégoire. And the title itself of the report is quite interesting. It says, on the necessity of annihilating the dialects and on the ways of doing so. So it's quite explicit. Let's do away with language variation. And the kind of arguments you find are roughly the same as what we had before. To make a language uniform means that we create a possibility for people to communicate without any obstacle, so that people can communicate their ideas among each other without any obstacle. So, a rationalist view, language as a means of communication. Again, the idea that the absence of a common language hinders emancipation. And this is a very nice idea he has. He says, well, actually, what we would want to see is basically that everybody could, at one time in his life, maybe, become a member of parliament. And so if we get more or less a rotational system in which everybody would, at some point, might be a member of parliament, then obviously we would also have to make sure that they could express themselves and that they would be able to talk themselves in the parliament. And in order to do that, they would all have to know the standard language. Okay? And then a final point here. Dialects, again, are seen as belonging to the old regime, to the ancien régime. So, let's now look. So that's the rationalist model, okay? A rationalist model where you have an insistence on the neutrality, the generality, the uniformity of the standard language as against the dialects. Dialects are something old, something that should be forgotten, something that belongs to a previous stage in the development of society. Now the Romantic model. And the Romantic model is actually, as I already suggested, nicely antithetical with regard to the rationalist model. If you think of the Romantic model, the basic idea, as I said, is language as not as a means of communication, but as a means of expression. Expressing what? Expressing identity. Expressing yourself, not necessarily communicating with people, but maybe communicating, but specifically communicating to show who you are. If you think about language in that way, then the imposition of a standard language, or the existence of a standard language which is the same for everybody, is precisely denying identity. The standard language which is uniform means it precisely because it is uniform and because you think of language as an expression of identity, the standard language is then seen as imposing the same identity on everybody. And you would not want that. On the contrary, it's language variation you want, because in language variation you get the possibility of expressing many, many, many different identities. So it's, from this point of view, it's really the opposite of the rationalist approach. The rationalist approach, language as a means of communication, favors maximal uniformity and generality. A Romantic approach, in which you think of language as expressing a specific identity, favors variation and actually resents the uniformity that is imposed, at least from the Romantic point of view, that is imposed from by the existence of standard languages. So the internal logic that you find in this Romantic model is an antithetical one with regard to the rationalist model. And specifically, the kind of reasoning that you get within a Romantic point of view is very often that the ideal of standardization is undermined, is deconstructed, we may say, as being ideological, as being an ideological filter on reality, as hiding the real realities. And it's interesting to see that the arguments with which you can do that from the Romantic point of view refer back to the different types of neutrality that we could identify as being important for standard languages. So for instance, when we said standard languages should ideally be geographically neutral, then a Romantic logic will say, yes, okay, that's the ideal, but in actual practice, most of the time, standard languages are the languages of one province or one region or one city that is so important in the country in question, in the community, in the nation in question, that is so important that it imposes its language on all the rest. So instead of there being a free choice for a neutral language, standard languages are not a matter of free choice, and standard languages do embody power relations, the power relations between the rich provinces and the poor provinces, for instance. And that's indeed, if you look at the history of standardization, at least in the Western countries, it's very often that way. What is standard French? Standard French is not just a neutral means of communication, it's the means of communication of a certain area of France that became important. Let's say, simplistically, Paris. The same with social neutrality. The standard languages claim social neutrality, but in actual fact, they are not socially neutral, because some people will have the standard language as their native language and others will not. And the people who have the standard language as their native language very often are people belonging to the elite, to the higher classes. So standard languages are not just neutral. Standard languages are very often socially marked as being the languages of certain groups. And the same is even true for thematic neutrality or thematic universality. We said you should be able to talk about anything in a standard language. Yes, that's probably the case. At the same time, the use of standard languages is typical for certain subjects and certain topics. The use of a standard language is, for instance, the language of administration and government. So when you think in, let us say, a romantic way, according to the romantic scheme of things, that you are a discriminated minority, then you will not like the language of the national government. Because the language of the national government you will see as being part of the power structures that oppress you. Okay? So from that point of view, romantic models will tend to deconstruct the ideology of standardization as being not neutral. And in terms of rhetoric then, how will people defend, from a romantic point of view, how will they defend language variation? Well, precisely by referring to the view that languages link up with identities. So if you deny the existence or deny certain languages, certain lects, dialects, language variety, the right to exist, as we saw in the quotes from these revolutionary men in France, when you deny dialects the right to exist, it's like denying people to have their own identity. If language is identity, then taking away language variation means taking away individual identities. So let me now, to complete this first step, give you an example of a quote that embodies this romantic view of language. And this is not an 18th century quote, this is a contemporary example, taken from a discussion on what is known as linguistic genocide. Linguistic genocide is the idea that we are living in a situation in which many different languages are being threatened with extinction. And they're threatened with extinction precisely because there are international languages, like English or Spanish in Latin America, for instance, that are a threat to the indigenous languages, that are a threat to the local languages. And the disappearance of the local languages is then, by some people, seen as actually a cultural genocide, not just a linguistic genocide, but a cultural genocide, in the sense that the culture of the people in question is disappearing together with their language. So what you get is things like this. Let me just highlight a few aspects. This is from a publication by Skutnap Kangas, who is one of the main champions of the indigenous languages and variety in the indigenous languages. And what she says are things like this. Well, let's perhaps read the quote as a whole. Indigenous peoples and minorities are the main bearers of linguistic and cultural diversity in the world. Over 80% of the world's languages exist in one country only, and the median language has no more than 5,000 speakers. Some of the direct main agents of linguistic and cultural genocide today are parts of what we call the consciousness industry, formal educational systems and mass media. The deficiency-based models that are used in most minority education invalidate the linguistic and cultural capital of minority children and their parents and communities. They make the resources of dominated groups seem handicaps or deficiencies instead of valued and validated non-material resources, or they render them invisible and therefore not possible to convert into material resources and positions of structural power. This happens just as much in global international relations and the McDonaldization of the world as it happens in ESL classrooms. So what do we get here? Notice how linguistic and cultural are consistently conjoined in this text. Anytime you find a reference to language, there's a reference to culture. That is to say, language is culture. Language is essential for cultural identity. That's the romantic model in its essence. Further, Non-native education is oppressive. If you want to, as you would do from a rationalist model, if you want to teach people how to use the general means of communication, which would then almost by definition be different from the indigenous local language, then that is not a form of emancipation, as you would assume from the rationalist point of view. No, from the romantic point of view, it's oppressive, the deficiency-based models, etc. And further, you have this rhetoric of threatened diversity. Minorities and minority languages are bearers of cultural diversity. You shouldn't take cultural diversity away, so you shouldn't touch the languages that embody the cultural diversity. Okay. So we now have our two basic models, the rationalist one and the romantic one. And to round off this first step, I could also point out, but I don't want to spend too much time on this, that there are different philosophical conceptions about the origin of language behind these two antithetical models. And if we had a bit more time, I could go into the 18th century voices that present those two, if you wish, foundational myths about language origin. On the one hand, you have views like those of Condillac, the French philosopher Condillac, who has a story about language as originating from interpersonal communicative gestures. So if language is communication, how do languages arise? Well, languages arise through communication, because there is some communicative need. Opposed to that is a view that you find with the German Romantic philosopher Herder, who has a clearly romantic conception of the origin of language and who has a story that both work with stories in a sense in their expose on the origin of language, and who has a story about language originating as a certain view of the world. Well, that's romantic, right? It's romantic because the view of the world that you have is typically expressing your identity. It's your own personal opinion, your own personal categorization of the world. So between categorization, language as categorization as something essential, individual to yourself, versus language as a communicative means with which you express something for someone else, not because it's your point of view, but because you want to communicate. Between those two, we have again this opposition between in that order, a romantic and a rationalist view. Okay, what I have here, this is part of Herder's story, and if your German is good enough, you could read it. And this is a part of Condillac's story, and if your French is good enough, you can read it. But it's not so essential for what I'm talking about here. The essential thing is that you get this opposition between a romantic and a rationalist conception of language variation. Fine. Okay, what next? A universal struggle between the two models? Well, maybe. But in actual fact, what happens is that at some point, you can see that. No, let me first say something else. What I'm going to do now is to present what I earlier called the two synthetic models. And why are they synthetic? They are synthetic because they bring together aspects of the two initial positions. Okay. The question we will have to ask ourselves is whether the way they bring together these two aspects is felicitous or not. Whether it is a happy synthesis, a successful synthesis or not. And we will see that that is actually not the case. So we will eventually still be left with tensions between the models. For the initial models, the tensions are quite clear. But even for the models that to some extent synthesize the two perspectives, we do get, or we do, we are still left with a certain tension. So what I will be doing now in the following steps is to explain the kind of synthesis we get, and then, of course, to point out that those syntheses do not remove all tensions within the models. Okay, now why could nationalism possibly be a synthesis or present some form of synthesis of a romantic and a rationalist ideal? Well, the basic logic here is one of converging levels. Why? Well, let's ask ourselves, given a rationalist approach, given a romantic approach, what is the optimal level at which to ensure communication, or the optimal level at which to express identities? And if we follow the logic of the rationalist and the romantic model in a very extreme way, or in a purely logical way, we arrive at a very extreme position. In what sense? Well, notice that rationalism has a universalist tendency. If you really want optimal neutral communication, what is the scope of your community? Well, ultimately, the scope of your community is humankind, all people. You would want, if you want maximalization of neutral communication, you would want it on the scale of the world. So maximal emancipation, maximal democracy, maximal open societies involve a universal nation and a world language. And if you think of something like Esperanto, it's a clear emanation of this universalist ideal. It's the idea, if you read the motivation that people have for promoting Esperanto, it's saying, we need one neutral language for the whole world, and everybody should speak it. Okay? So the internal tendency of a rationalist approach is to be universalist, to apply language uniformization to the entire world. That's not very realistic for practical reasons, and certainly not in the 18th century. So what happens in the 19th century, if you wish, is that the actual level at which you standardize is the level of a nation. It's an existing political community. That's the level on which you impose standard languages, not the world. I mean, those French revolutionaries may try to impose French or to spread French or to teach people how to use French in the entire French territory, but they would not be able to export the use of French to the entire world. Well, they actually try to do so to some extent, at least to the rest of Europe, but for practical reasons that you can very well imagine, that's not something you could really do. So in actual practice, the extreme position of the extreme universalist position of a rationalist approach naturally shrinks to a certain level, and that's in practice the level of the nation. So you get standardization as part of 19th century nationalism. Okay. There is some background here, but that's more belonging to political theory than to linguistics about the different kinds of nationalisms that you get, but I don't really want to go into that, except for saying that this type of conception of a nation, in which a nation is a body of communicating people, so to speak, that is what in political theory is known as liberal nationalism, or with the German term Staatsnationalismus. Then, on the other hand, what's the tendency that is inherent in a romantic model? Well, in a romantic model, you get the other extreme. In the romantic model, which identity do you want to express? What's the maximal identity you could express? Well, that's your own identity. So rationalism has an individualist tendency. And of course, you know about that. If you think about the romantic movement in general, it's a highly individualistic movement. You can see that in the arts, for instance. So the ultimate identity that you might want to express is the identity of an individual person. And maximal diversity, because that is what you want in a romantic model, maximal diversity involves individualism. But of course, again, this is, on the level of language, an ideal that you cannot attain. Because what would the maximal expression of identity from the linguistic point of view mean? That would mean that we have individual languages. Each person his own identity, each person his own language. That would be the consequence of following the logic that we found, for instance, in Skutnaptanganga's quote on linguistic genocide and so on. Each person his own identity, each person his own language. But even the most extreme romanticist will not want to abolish communication as a whole. So if you still want some communication and you stick to the romantic conception of language, the scope of the identity that you want to express will have to be bigger than the individual person, right? In the rationalist model, it had to be smaller than humankind as a whole. In the romantic model, it has to be bigger than the individual as an individual, as a single person, as a single entity. So what is the identity that you will want to express from the point of view of 19th century romantic ideals? Well, that's the identity of a group of people. To put it more shortly, of a people in the romantic sense of a group of persons who have the same identity, who share an identity as a people. And that's from the point, and of course, coupled to that, associated with that, is the notion that those people, or that group of people, will also constitute a nation of its own, will have the expression of its identity not just in the language, but also in social and political institutions. So, for practical reasons, you don't stick with the individual, but you enlarge the scope of the romantic ideal to the common language as a bearer of ethnic, cultural group identity. And that's, of course, also what we saw in the quote on linguistic genocide. It's not about individual identities, it's about group identities. And if you link that again to the political views, political nationalism, then this would be an example of romantic nationalism. A nation is a group of people with the same identity. That's romantic nationalism. In the liberal nationalism idea, a nation is a group of people who have decided freely to organize their common life in a certain way. In a romantic view of nationalism, you get the nation as a group of people with a similar identity. Now, if we look at, and so you can see how the two approaches can come together in the idea of nationalism, of having a nation of intercommunicating persons, and having a nation as people with the same identity. And what you see in the 19th century and in the development of nationalism in the 19th century is precisely that in most cases, there are some exceptions, but in most cases, language within a nation is presented as both of these things. Language is presented as the bearer of our national identity and is at the same time presented as the necessary tool that we need to organize our political institutions, to organize our education, to ensure that people have access to education, and so on. So there, the two converge. So in principle, nationalism may combine both a romantic and a rationalist conception of language variation. So, To summarize, between the extremes of universalism and individualism, rationalism and romanticism may converge towards the middle, coupling feelings of identity with claims to political independence and free organization of those people coming together in the nation. Now, in actual fact, what happens is somewhat different. Oh yes, let me first briefly mention, I'm not going to have a close look at this quotation, but already in the text from Grégoire, which I presented earlier, the French text, you can find a nationalist tendency. So I presented the text as if they presented a rational ideal in a very pure sense, but to some extent there are already clearly nationalist overtones in those texts. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with philosophy and with dialectic philosophy, you will notice that when I take the steps of putting one thesis, rationalism, and then romanticism as the antithesis, and then nationalism as the synthesis, then being good followers of the German philosopher Hegel, we would have to ask ourselves, yes, but is this a successful synthesis or not? But that's what Hegel talks about, right? You have unsuccessful and successful syntheses when you have antithetical processes. Well, you can't really say that nationalism is a happy synthesis of the two approaches. Far from it, in fact, because there are two types of problems that remain. But I will focus only on the first one. And the first one is quite easy to see. That's the demarcational problem. The demarcational problem in the sense that if you think about the history of nationalism, if you think about the history of 19th century nationalism in Europe, for instance, it's obvious that there is a tension or that there is a continual struggle about the level at which the nation should be situated. And there is a continual struggle between minority groups that live in a certain existing nation, but that do think that they need or that they have the right to have their own independent nation. If you think of all the nationalist wars there have been, well, it's clear that nationalism, that a nationalist conception does not automatically stabilize. It doesn't stabilize at all, in fact. You always get the tension between existing bigger entities and smaller entities that think that they should be one of the bigger entities. Okay? So nationalism is not really a solution, and nationalism, in that sense, is not a solution to the question of linguistic diversity as long as you keep the tension between, for instance, nation states and then ethnic or cultural minorities. Ethnic or cultural minorities that claim their own language, the right to their own language, and the right to an equal treatment for their own language. And again, a lot of the linguistic history, at least in Europe, a lot of the linguistic history of, let's say, the sociolinguistic history of European nations in the 19th century has to do with these questions. Okay. As I said, I won't go into the second problem. That's maybe for the discussion. Then, okay, given that nationalism is clearly not a solution because there is a conversion towards the middle, but the two tendencies definitely do not automatically reach a happy solution or stable solution. Let's look at another tendency that, another ideological tendency that you can see emerging in, let's say, the last quarter of the 20th century. That's the type of ideology that we know as postmodernism. What does postmodernism involve? Well, in a sense, and even, yeah, it's even quite explicit in the debate about postmodernism and in the philosophical expressions, philosophical definitions of postmodernism. In a sense, it's a reaction against nationalism. And if you think about what kind of synthesis I presented from the nationalist point of view, it's a synthesis that takes the form of a disjunction. A disjunction of the two models, right? We start from a position of either or. And the question is, can we have both? Well, nationalism is a way of trying to get both models at the same time. The nation would be a way of trying to get both models at the same time. But still, from the point of view of language, nationalist linguistic policies go for only one language. So what would be the other solution? The other solution would be to say, well, let's just accept the variety. Let's accept the variation. And that's a typically postmodern logic, because what is the philosophical basis of postmodernism? The philosophical basis is, if we start from the Romantic point of view, you can have many identities. You can at the same time be an inhabitant of a specific region and a member of a nation state. So linguistically, let's do the same thing. Instead of saying that it always has to be either or, why can't it be both at the same time? That's a conjunctive way of thinking about things. And notice then that this way of thinking, where you can say, let's just accept the variation, can also be applied again from a Romantic and a rationalist point of view. From a Romantic point of view, so let's call that Romantic postmodernism. That's not a standard term, but if we call it Romantic postmodernism, we get a logic of multiple identities. It's not that you, as I said, it's not that you have to be only one type of person. You can be different type of persons. You can be both a Breton and a French citizen. You can be a Scots or a Brit and an Englishman. You can be a Fleming and a Belgian at the same time. So you can be member of a minority group and at the same time belong to a nation, or whatever identity you choose, also in cultural terms, not just in political terms, but in cultural terms just as well. So the rhetoric that you find there is then a rhetoric of shifting, fragmented, flexible identities. There are some major philosophical statements about that. If you think about, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but there are some famous French philosophers like Baudrillard who have this idea of the old grand narratives, the old stories are in decline, the stories like the nation, progress, enlightenment, they're in decline, and instead of that, you get fragmentation. You get all things at the same time. So that's thinking in a postmodern way from the point of view of Romanticism, from the point of view of identities. We can also think, this is much less common, but we can also take a postmodern position from the point of view of communication, from a functional point of view. Let's say from a rationalist point of view. In that case, a rationalist motivation for a postmodern stance would again involve a logic of multiplicity, but a logic of functional multiplication. That is to say, why restrict yourself to one language? You can have many languages, or you can have many different styles within one language. Within one language, you can speak your local dialect on a local level, and you speak the standard language at another level. So from the linguistic point of view, this is a defense of multilingualism, bilingualism, multilingualism, and stylistic variation. And the rhetoric that goes with it is likewise a rhetoric of functional differentiation and multilingualism. So if you see what happens to the two basic models here, you see that they are combined, but they are combined in a different kind of synthesis, not a synthesis by talking about or by focusing on the number of people, the level of people at which the common language should be achieved, but by saying, no, individual people may have different languages, just like they may have different identities. And that would figure, that would make sense, both from a romantic point of view and from a rationalist point of view. So again, it's a synthesis which brings together the two initial positions. Fine, but, well, fine or not so fine. Because again, the question will be, if we go from rationalism to the antithesis of romanticism and then to the false synthesis of nationalism, do we then get a successful synthesis in the postmodern approach? No, we don't, because the tensions that we mentioned, or the tensions that we refer to, are present in this approach as well. In what sense? Again, I have the two problems, but I'll focus on just one of them, on the first one. Well, the demarcation problems that we could identify from the nationalist point of view, which group is your identity group? Which group is your nation? Those demarcation problems are replaced by problems with, and that's a very concrete question, and it's a question that arises a lot in contemporary society. It's, to a large extent, it's a question like, when do we speak English and when do we speak our local or national language? If we have something like the European Union, European Community, it's a political institution that brings together different countries, different nations, each with their own languages. But what is the language they will use when they communicate with each other? And which languages do we accept within the European as official languages? That's not an answer, that's not a question that gets an automatic answer. It's a question that leads to tensions. Tensions of the kind, if you take a country like Spain, where you have Castilian as the main language, Spanish as the main language, but Catalan as a minority language of a substantial size, then the question is not just, the traditional nationalist question will be, what is the function, what is the role, the status of Catalan within the Spanish nation? That question is now, in a sense, replaced by the question, in the European Union, which accepts multilingualism. Initially, Spain would not accept multilingualism. Now it does, but initially in the 19th century, it would certainly not accept it. But so when we move the discussion from the level of the single nation that wants to be unilingual to a larger body that wants to be multilingual, we still have a question. Because we still have a question, should we accept Catalan as one of the official languages of the European Union or not? So the tensions and the demarcational problems actually remain. It's not the case. Some of the tensions are relieved, that's certainly the case, but in general it's not the case that the debates will go away. Whatever type of synthesis you use, the nationalist one or the postmodern one, we are still left with demarcational problems and questions that will have to be settled. So, let me give you an overview of what I've been saying. We have three things to talk about and three models, if you wish to talk about, or 3 centuries to talk about. There's the 18th century, when we get the archetypal models. There's the 19th century, when you get a nationalist synthesis or transformation of the initial positions. And you get the 20th century, when we have a postmodern transformation of the positions. For each of those 3 periods, we can identify the rationalist point of view, the romantic point of view, and then the difficulty that exists between them. So, for the 18th century, we can say the rationalist position is that the common language is an instrument of is a neutral instrument of political, cultural, and educational participation. The Romantic position is that an imposed standard language is a discrimination of specific identities. And the tension between both, obviously, is that the two are antithetical to each other. You'll see in the chart that I refer to the Dialektik der Aufklärung. That is actually, that's a philosophical concept. I won't explain that in this context, but it has to do with explaining the antithesis that exists between the two basic models. That's if you want to do some more philosophy when you're through with linguistics, so to speak. Then the 19th century transformation. The rationalist position is that the nation is the basis of a liberal democracy, and the nation needs one language in order to ensure its democratic status. The Romantic position is that the nation is a focus of cultural and ethnic identity, and it needs one language as the expression of its cultural and ethnic identity. And so these two positions could possibly come together. But in actual fact, they often do not come together because there is a problem of the demarcation of the relevant group. There is then a conflict between existing nation states and ethnic cultural minority groups with their own language, linguistic minority groups that claim equal rights or more rights for their own identity as expressed in the language. Then if we look at the postmodern transformation, the rationalist position is that we get diversity and multilingualism as functional diversity and functional specialization. The Romantic position is that diversity and multilingualism are the expression of fragmented and flexible identities, and the tension between both is again a demarcational tension, demarcation of relevant functions in this way, not demarcation of the relevant group, but a demarcation of the relevant functions. What exactly is the shape of the functional specialization that we would go for? So, all in all, by way of conclusion, I've argued that dominant conceptions of language diversity form a logical pattern, if you wish, to mirror cultural models, mirroring each other, that form a logical pattern, a dialectical pattern, if you wish, of with both antithetical and synthetical tendencies. And if we were to restrict our sociolinguistic analysis of models of language variation to just one or a few of those models, that would be an impoverishment. To get a good idea and to for instance, discourse analysis of language debate, one would need to take into account the full spectrum of the positions. We should also accept that all models are ideological to some extent. They would be ideological. If we accept that there are tensions within all of the models that we've considered, then a strict defense of just one of the models as the best one could easily turn into a way of masking the tensions. That's why it's important that if you are critical as linguists, and if you look at the way in which people talk about language variation and language variety, you should be careful to keep in mind that there is always this hidden tension in all of the different models. And unfortunately, of course, but as a way of ensuring as a way of being conscious of the fact that our role as linguists is limited, we should also see that we may, as linguists, identify the different models, but that does not necessarily mean that we've solved the problems, that we've solved the tensions that are inherent in the problems, in the models. But anyway, even if we can't solve the tensions, identifying the models and laying bare their internal logic is quite interesting in itself. So I hope I may have given you some idea of how this might be done. Thank you.